Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Charedi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. Welcome back, friends. The topic of judicial reform has been one of the most contentious and complicated in recent Israeli history. As we focus here on the Charedi community, it's fascinating to think about what their particular role in this story has been. Historically, as we'll discuss with today's guest, Chareidim have been somewhat pragmatic when it comes to policies outside of their core issue set. Does this judicial reform question follow that pattern? Or are there unique elements here that in fact have demanded a greater degree of attention and ideological parity with other right-wing parties? What is the impact of judicial reform on related questions such as army conscription and Charedi involvement in broader Israeli life? We'll discuss these questions and more with today's guest, Dr. Moshe Koppel. Moshe Koppel is a computer scientist by training, but is perhaps the most significant architect of judicial reform, coming from the perspective that there is a great need for change in this arena. And as a true expert in this field, he's also a great expositor of these arguments. And it is fascinating to hear his record of how this entire chapter unfolded, where things unraveled, and again, how the Chareidim in today's society may or may not be playing a unique role in the continuing saga of judicial reform, which has become, and in fact surprisingly remains, such a pronounced and durable wedge issue in the state of Israel. Our conversation with Dr. Moshe Koppel. We are here with Professor Moshe Koppel, a computer scientist and also someone who's deeply involved in politics and the intellectual scaffolding behind certain political ideas, which we're going to get to. First of all, how are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me.
It's great to be here. We are actually live in the Iyun podcast studios, which we are not always privileged to do when I do these interviews. So that's extra fun. And Professor Koppel is not a stranger to these precincts. He, I think, has spoken here many times and been on panels and who knows what else. But he knew where everything was right away, better than I did even. So I'm glad you feel right at home. Let's jump right into it. Give us a little bit of a background about yourself. First of all, where you're from and kind of how you ended up here in this wonderful city of Jerusalem or its environs.
Okay, well, I grew up in New York City. I went to Chafetz Chaim on the west side. I went to Chafetz Chaim in Queens. Then I went to YU, and I did a doctorate in math at NYU and postdoc in Princeton, and then I came on Aliyah a very, very long time ago. And since then, I've been a professor of math and computer science at Bar Ilan. I have, Baruch Hashem, a wonderful family with four married kids and a whole bunch of grandchildren. I live in Efrat, and I also have two think tanks. One of them is called Kohelet. It does policy stuff, and the other one's called Dicta, and it uses AI for Torah. AI for Torah. Okay, well, I'd love to hear more about that, even though it's not our topic per se today. But I want to unwind. Obviously, you have a very interesting background, and largely, I guess, again, math and computer science, which are very hardcore STEM topics, and yet you somehow became deeply involved in the topic of judicial reform, which I want to rewind and take our listeners back in a sort of a time portal to before October 7th, 2023, because the judicial reform, call it storm, firestorm, was a massive, massive issue in Israel. I myself actually wrote an article in Mishpacha magazine about a crazy story I had when I basically got stuck on the train and missed my flight as a result of being caught between the two types of demonstrations, the Ba'ad and the Negeds. And it was the day where they switched teams, they switched sides. So the people, the anti-judicial reform, the anti-judicial reform people were in Jerusalem, and the opposite was in Tel Aviv, and they were switching and they were coming back home respectively. And I got caught right in the middle.
but yet I had this very touching story where a woman from very hard, left and very hard anti, actually did this incredible kindness for me and did everything she could to help me make my flight and grabbed my bags and jumped with me off the train into the airport. And it was a very poignant moment about, about unity despite these deep fissures, but deep fissures they were. And, it was kind of sidelined for quite a while, and it seems to have reemerged. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, perhaps. And, many people actually might argue that in some ways the judicial reform debates somehow precipitated an October 7th, either concretely that in the way that our enemies could kind of see the undoing of the social fabric of our society. And obviously some would make the claim spiritually that we sort of we're losing that connectedness that, is our spiritual protection. But either way, it was something that seemed to have halted for a while and now has returned. But I guess my main question to start for you is, how does a nice Jewish boy, computer scientist, a STEM guy, get involved in something so distinct and unusual as judicial revolution or the issue of the way that the courts operate in Israel?
Okay, so this is a very long story, way too long for this podcast, but I'll give you the very short version. Sometime around 2004 or so, I was just another Jew who would complain about politics, between the Kigel and the Chulent on Shabbos, and I said, I'm going to do something about it, and I went down to the Knesset. I went to meet a Chaver Knesset by the name of Miki Eitan. He was the head of Vadat Chukah Chok Mishpat. It's the Constitution and Law Committee. It's one of the important committees in the Knesset. And I told him my opinions about politics, and he said, you know what, we're starting to write a constitution in this committee next week. A constitution's a big deal, and Israel had been around by that point for almost 60 years and didn't have a constitution. He said, would you like to sit in on the meetings? And I said, gee, this is an opportunity of a lifetime.
And just as I understand, you were a random guy that just showed up at the Knesset and said, hey, let's talk. And then all of a sudden he invites you into this committee. I mean, there must have been more to it.
No, I was a total rando. But the thing is that we hit it off. In other words, I started telling him, my opinions about certain things that he was involved with. And he kind of thought that I got it, and he said, why don't you come in? You'll be an observer. And I came, and I was an observer for a few months. I sat there every Sunday morning for 4 hours. And then after a few months, there was an issue. Somebody, said, well, we need a draft of a chapter on what it means for Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. And he looks around the room and he says, you are going to prepare the drafts. And that's how I got into politics. That's exactly how. So ever since then, I've been, involved in writing laws and whatever. And I met a lot of underemployed, very intelligent people. And I pulled them all together. I got a budget and went to work. This was in 2012.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's such an Israeli sounding story. It's like, you get the guy from the falafel stand or your cab driver to help write the constitution for the country. A guy comes in with his opinions, gets it or not. You weren't an elected official. You weren't an unelected official. You were an unofficial. And
yeah,
and here you
I was exactly. I was literally a random guy, but I took it very seriously.
Yeah.
So I actually read everything that had been written about the topic, and I spent a lot of time talking to Professor Ruth Gavizon, who's really the expert on constitutional law in Israel at the time. I took it seriously, and I actually produced a document, by the way, you'll be interested to hear, that was more or less agreed on by Rav Avram Ravitz, Zichrono Livracha, who's the representative of Yadut Torah in the Knesset, and a fellow who was the representative of the Shinui party. That was Tommy
Lapid's party,
anti-Haredi
Tommy
party.
Lapid,
Yeah, Tommy Lapid. And I actually got a document that they both agreed on. So that document that I wrote in 2004 that they agreed on was passed by the Knesset as a basic law. 14 years later, in 2018, you probably heard of it as the nation state law.
Absolutely, and that also created quite a bit of controversy among some of the minorities and Arabs and Bedouins and so forth. And of course, it was ethnocentric and so forth, which, I mean, it patently is. I mean, it is an ethnocentric state by design. But had you been interested in the law and in politics previously? I mean, had you thought a lot about issues of constitutionality and things of that nature until this point? Like, what sparked that interest initially?
Actually, not much more than your typical person who reads the newspaper. I had ideas, but in the end, it seemed to me like what computer scientists called a constraint satisfaction problem. We've got a problem here. Okay, we need to satisfy this, and this condition because the left wants it, and this, and condition because the right wants it. Is there some kind of solution here that could work for everybody? If you just think of it in the abstract like that, you could get stuff done. And I did. I was thinking of it in a rather abstract way. One of the things you need to do when you're writing laws is kind of step out of your own biases, what they call in Israel pozitsya, right? You need to say, well, wait a minute, other people have opinions here too. We're not going to get away with just doing, well, but let's see what's the best we can do here. It works.
Interesting. So it sounds like, you worked on this law for quite a long time, or this draft. Explain, for our audience, and some of them may be informed already, but just as a review so that we're all kind of operating from the same baseline, Israel does not have a written constitution the way that the United States has. It has a series of basic laws, which seem to be like these kind of super laws that have a greater degree of impact and a higher threshold for being rescinded and so forth. But what are the implications of the issues that with not having a constitution? Why is that a challenge, and how has that presented problems for the society in some sort of a structural way?
Okay, so there are advantages and disadvantages to not having a constitution, right? So the advantage is that when you have a highly polarized society, people who have very different ideas of what kind of state they want, you don't want to be locked in too much to the vision of, right? If they had written a constitution in 1948, probably by the time say now, the constitution that we'd look at that they had in 1948, very well might go, wait a minute, this kind of reflects the secular socialist biases of the majority at the time. This is not what we want. So there may be advantages in terms of flexibility. The disadvantage, though, is a very obvious one, and one that we suffered from greatly during the period of judicial reform and the battles around it, which is, what a constitution should do at minimum is determine the rules of the game, right? If there aren't well-established rules of the game, then you have different groups with power of different kinds pulling everything in their direction all the time. So, for example, because we don't have very well-defined checks and balances between the different branches of government, what you have is that since 1980, basically, Aaron Barak joined the court in 1979. Since around 1980, with the Yellow Pages decision, we don't need to get into the technicalities, they've been consistently adding more and more power and authority to the judicial branch, right? And this will just keep going, right? And now the problem is, okay, so you say, well, let's start writing a constitution that might define exactly what they can do and they can't do, and that might backfire, because who gets to use a constitution? It's judges who get to use a constitution, right? They could strike down laws of the legislature based on the constitution. That might just pour more gas on this fire, right? So it's a tough call. I personally wrote two different constitutions, one with Mickey Eitan. The two of us sat together after I was in, an observer on his committee for a few years. Then we literally, the two of us wrote a constitution, and also another one with another group of people, the Institute for Zionist Strategy. I wrote another constitution. So I am a believer in writing a constitution, but I'm aware of the fact that it could backfire. What
does a constitution benefit over, let's say, the basic laws, again, which have these high thresholds for being rebuffed and so forth?
Right. So fundamentally, you could have just a whole bunch of basic laws and say, look, these serve as the Constitution.
Yeah, de facto, yeah.
Israel. Right. You could do that. The problem is right now that the basic laws that we have don't cover a lot of things that need to be covered in a constitution. So the nation-state law that passed in 2018 is an example of something that should have been, that would be in a constitution, right? What makes this state different than every other one? And so that gap was closed in 2018. But there's a lot of stuff on the, first of all, on the kind of, rights, human rights, civil rights that you expect to see in a constitution. Those are covered in very general terms in Chok Kvod Adam V'Cheruto. But that's an incomplete law. And on the other hand, the judges have taken that law and turned it into, it's like a Rorschach test. They look at it and they find everything they want to find there. So equality was not put into that, for example, which is something that Americans kind of take for granted. The judges read equality into the law, even though it's not there. And then they started reading things into equality, that most people don't even. So, for example, there are Chareidim who want to go to university, but they want to have separate classes for Chareidim, right. And they want those separate classes for Chareidim to be gender separated, right, so that men and women are not together. One can debate whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but the point is that there's a market for that. The universities were willing to provide it. So both sides were agreed on this, and nevertheless, the court intervened and said, no. We're not going to let you do that because there's no separate but equal. So on that basis, right, this is Brown versus Board of Education. Yeah. It's not actually part of Israeli law.
Right.
But Israeli judges decided that the equality that they found in this law that isn't actually there now should be interpreted according to no separate but equal. And therefore, the end result is that because there's this very vague law, Kvod Adam v'Cheruto, which if you look at it, looks pretty benign, but somehow a consequence of that law is that Hebrew University cannot provide Chareidim with gender-separated classes. That's a stretch, okay? So if we would put together a constitution that would be more complete, it might make things better because we'd have a complete constitution and somehow there would be agreed upon rules, but it might make things worse.
Right. I mean, you find, when you have an activist court in the United States, there's always a battle over the composition of the court for the very reason that people understand that ideology can be read into these documents. And whether you see,
right.
Whether it's living constitutionalism or originalism and all of those kinds of judicial philosophies, a text is a text, and its interpreters can bend the Constitution for those who would perceive it as doing such, the same way they could bend or stretch a basic law. So why would necessarily a constitution end up benefiting in any way beyond perhaps greater degree of specificity, maybe? But
yeah, exactly. But you're right. It might help. It might not help. In any case, the one thing that I think is very important for people to understand is that in the United States, you say, well, is the court activist? Is it not activist? Are they? Well, it all depends on who gets appointed to the court, right? And what happens is, well, sometimes there's a Republican president and sometimes there's a Democratic president, and they make the appointments that they want, and the court reflects that. So more or less over time, the court is going to reflect, the entire population of the United States, right? Because you'll have Republicans and have Democrats running the country. In Israel, that is not the case. In Israel, for historical reasons, the judges are all activists, and because the judges to the courts, all the courts, but especially the Supreme Court, are appointed not, as in the United States, by the other branches of government, but among the 9 people on the committee, 3 of them are sitting Supreme Court justices, and you need 7 out of 9. Well, the end result is that the judges have a veto. And that means that, unlike in the United States, where you get judges of this type and judges of that type, over here, it's almost impossible to get conservative judges appointed. Of course, when there's a right-wing government, then 3 out of the 9, 2 of them are ministers and 1 of them is a member of Knesset, also come from the coalition. And so if there's a right-wing coalition, there's at least a
minority representation.
There's a mutual veto. No, there's both sides.
Right.
There's a mutual veto. So in such cases, they'll make a deal. But when the left is in power, well, then you have the judges and the 2 ministers, et cetera, and they can just ram through any appointment that they want. So it's not a symmetric situation over here, right? There's no symmetry between left and right, between coalition and opposition. What you have is essentially a permanent veto to those 3 judges who are, for historical reasons, almost always going to be activists and left-wingers.
It's interesting, just to go back one more question on the general idea of constitutionalism and overall. You mentioned that had a constitution been authored in 1948, it would have become rendered almost obsolete at this point because of the changing nature of time. The United States Constitution remains in some profound way, a very relevant document, right? It still is the foundation, the lodestar, 250 basically years later. And again, albeit with varying types of interpretive devices utilized, some again honing or towing to the text itself, more strictly, and others reading more into it and so forth. But nonetheless, it's been deemed sufficient. It's not been ossified. So why would that document have been different, or why would a document that we would write today be different?
If James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were writing our Constitution in 1948, maybe I would be less skeptical.
Okay, just the caliber of the men writing the document, or the authors.
Yeah.
Okay, so take us back to 2023 again briefly, or to pre-October 7th, 2023. It's hard for people to understand or to imagine the level of rancor and divisiveness if they didn't experience it, viscerally. Can you explain why this was such a profoundly painful and almost existential problem, especially for those on the left who really felt like the fabric of society was being torn apart, like their grasp on their reality was slipping away? And I understand there are all kinds of theories about this was going to transform the character of the nation, and it was turned into some kind of a theocracy and so forth. But what was going on that was so nettlesome to those who were obsessively opposed to the judicial reform?
Okay, you're asking me to actually explain people who are opposed to me, which is
yes.
I don't mind that being a little bit unfair to me, but it's unfair to them. But
that's okay.
But yeah, okay.
It's better than them not having any representation at all. So
well, I'm not sure they'd agree, but
I guess we'll find out.
But nevertheless, so the first thing you need to understand is that almost all of the elements of this reform, which many of which were written by Kohelet, the think tank that I run. Most of them were the kinds of things that if I told an American, this is what is going on in this reform, they would go, you mean it hasn't been like that until now, right? So, we wanted to change the way that judges are appointed so that judges don't have a veto, right? Sitting judges don't have a veto over who joins the court. That was, one example. We wanted, that if a basic law cannot be reviewed by the court, that's obvious, right? It's like saying the Constitution can't be reviewed by the court. Yes, because on what basis would they be reviewing it? There's nothing above it.
Right, it's kind of circular.
Right? There's nothing above it in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
You take a regular statute, you can decide whether it's consistent with the Constitution or with a basic law, but what criteria would you be using to judge?
There has to be some constant around which
there needs to be something above it, right? Yeah. So these are the kinds of things. Okay, I just want to say that I'm not a theocrat. Okay, I was not involved in this because I was going, gee, how can we like get a theocracy going here? Like these nettlesome judges are in the way. That is not what this was about. This was literally about making the Israeli judicial system more like every other Western democracy. Okay, it was very, very basic stuff. There were some exceptions, which we'll get to later. It's actually quite the exceptions are worth discussing. Okay, I'll just give you a hint now. The thing that was probably the biggest stretch in the reform, and not one which we supported or had written, was the override, right? Which is something that exists already in one of the Israeli basic laws and exists in Canada. The idea is that if the court strikes down a statute, the Knesset can say, well, we heard what you have to say, but we're overriding your strike down, and we're putting the law
with a supermajority? Or a simple majority?
Not with a supermajority. I think it's a bad idea.
Well, if it's only a simple majority, then you're effectively rendering the court, completely feckless.
Okay, well, not completely, but yes. And that was, I agree that was too much. But we'll come back to why that was there later. There's a story to tell. But in any event, I did all this really not coming from a place of, I want Israelis to have fewer rights. It was really from a place, I do not want a small homogeneous group of people like the court or the judicial bureaucracy around it to have this much authority, okay? There are checks and balances on the other branches of government, judicial review. I'm in favor of that, but there need to be checks and balances on the court too. So You can't have the court appointing appointing its successors, and you can't have the court striking down, essentially the Constitution, which in Israel is the basic laws. These are the kinds of things that I was very opposed to. Now, once this whole thing began and Kohelet somehow got caught up in the whole thing because Yariv Levin thanked us when at his big press conference on January the 4th.
And just to understand, Yariv Levin was the minister most involved. Obviously, Simcha Rotman also involved as well. And on the Kohelet side, who were the principal authors? Was that yourself? Was that Eugene Katranovich?
It was more Aviad Bakshi, Aaron Garber, Ariel Erlich. These are the... Eugene does international law. These are the guys who do the local stuff more. And I made it my business to meet everybody on the other side who would meet me. Okay, so we had meetings with a lot of the legal eagles on the other side. We had very, very intensive meetings. In other words, we'd meet 8 hours at a time. We met a few times a week for 8 hours.
And this is all, by the way, a hobby for you, quote unquote. This is tachbiv.
Yes. So I was, but if you're doing it, do it. You know.
Yeah.
So I would meet with these guys together with my team, and some of them were people who were like speaking at the protest at Kaplan, heavy duty. And we negotiated, and we came to an agreement. We actually had a compromise agreement. We gave it to the president, who had insinuated himself into the whole process. The president just killed the whole thing.
Really?
The compromise that he put forward was not what we had given him. It was what the judges wanted. And but I spent a lot of time in it. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is so that the listeners should understand that this problem could have been solved with goodwill. Okay, a compromise was available, and people in the know knew what it was. But the other thing that happened, and this is in response to your question, like what was going on the other side. I met with former ministers, with former heads of the Mossad and the Shabak, with pilots who said that they weren't going to fly, with business types who were going to take their money out of the country. Okay, I met with all of these people. Okay, the craziest people, the one whose names you see in the newspaper, all that, they refused to even meet with us. Okay, but I really met with a lot of them. Now, what happened was, apart from those that were serious and with whom we came to compromises, in most cases, the way it went was this: we get together. My first question was, tell me what it is in the proposed reform that you don't like, and let's fix it together. All right? I'm sure we can find a compromise here that we can all live with. And invariably, their response to me was, I don't know what's in this reform. I just know one thing. I know that it's being passed by people in the Knesset whom I don't like because they don't look like me. And it's going to limit the powers of people in the court who do look like me. Okay, I trust the people in the court. I don't trust Bibi Netanyahu. I don't trust Bezalel Smotrich. I don't trust Itamar Ben-Gvir. I don't trust Yariv Levin. I don't trust Simcha Rotman. Okay, but I do trust the 2 or 3 judges whose names they actually knew, right? And that's what it was all about. Okay, now if you want to drill down a little bit more deeply, why now? Right.
Well, and especially because you mentioned that 18 years or whatever it was earlier, you had drafted a bipartisan, acceptable framework for this kind of a thing, right?
Yeah. Well, by the time it passed the nation state law thing, the left was completely against it. Even people who had signed on as co-sponsors when we first started bringing it forward as a law in 2011. Suddenly in 2018, they decided this is a bad idea, and they were opposed to it. Politics in Israel is pretty nasty.
But it's strange because that basically implies tribal. But that basically implies that the country was, or at least certain parties within the country, are moving left. Which is hard to imagine.
No,
when the overall country is moving
left.
Right.
It's not that they're moving left. It's that people who actually know that something. Look, there were plenty of people who were leaders of the protests against judicial reform, who had themselves previously said we need judicial reform and had proposed exactly the same ideas. The point is that Israeli politics is extremely tribal in the end, okay? So that even if you understand as an individual that a particular law is necessary, or that a particular law is bad, right? But your tribe is on the other side. In the end, you're going to go with your tribe. And what happened is that in Israel, the tribes became way too clear in the end of 2022. Until then, every time there was an election, you made a coalition. Well, there was always, it was usually a right-wing coalition, not always. And there was some, representation of the center-left in there, whether it was Tzipi Livni or Ehud Barak or Moshe Koppel, or, right? Every time there was somebody on the other side. This time, because everybody on the left and the center essentially boycotted Bibi, they said, we're not going to be in a government with Bibi. The end result was that you had a government which was, to put it simply, basically only from people, okay? Not exactly what it was, is Chareidim, Dati Leumi, and then Masortiim and the Likud, right? So the Likud types who are, even if they're not, completely religious, but are sympathetic to religion and traditional, etc. And suddenly you had, the left looking around, especially the ones who saw themselves essentially as the successors of the old Labor Party, right? And they looked around and said, they've always kind of thought of this country as being theirs, and everybody else being, we have to let them be here. We don't really have much choice in them. But we run the country. We run all the institutions of the country. And, these guys are around. Suddenly they looked around and they said, hey, we are now in the opposition. We don't have any representation in the coalition, right? Now, for most people, that's a normal situation. You're not always in the coalition, but they were not accustomed to not having any representation in the coalition. Right? Until 77, they were accustomed to running the country.
Right.
The other guys didn't have any representation, but that didn't bother them at all, right? And then since then, the right was winning most of the elections, but at least they still ran they ran the army, they ran the courts, they ran the communication, the media, right? They ran the universities. Things were looking good. They began to realize that things are not looking good for them, that they're not in this coalition, and the demographics are only going to get worse for them. And if the coalition starts taking on the unelected institutions of the state, right? If suddenly the top echelons of the army actually reflect the right-wing views of the coalition, which is not the case now, and if the public media, I'm not talking about private media, but public media starts getting taken over by the right, things are going to look pretty bad for them. Okay, now bad in a democratic way. Yes, sometimes.
Which is, of course, the entire irony of this campaign, which was couched as a campaign to save democracy, right? And Demokratia was the rallying cry.
Their rallying cry was democracy, which is exactly what they did not want, right? What their rallying cry really should have been is, "You will not replace us." Okay, that was the subtext that they really meant to say, but that doesn't sell.
But there must be a more nuanced kind of rejoinder to that, because you have very smart people, and people, let's say like David Horowitz of the Times of Israel, who's center left or whatever, and very, very concerned about the lack of democracy. Again, he constantly using that kind of a word within this framework. What about this kind of hit that nerve? Besides, of course, I understand the replacement theory, situation, but from a kind of an abstract intellectual perspective, what was in there that triggered that fear?
Look, I did not suggest that the first draft of this law, of the reform, was perfect. There's never, I've seen a lot of first drafts. They're never perfect, okay? Well, that's why there's a process. You come and negotiate. But what happened was the left, instead of coming to negotiate, and they just had a fit. I could tell you that Yariv Levin was more than happy to negotiate. I could tell you this because he asked me to get the leaders of the opposition into his office so that he could negotiate. And I personally went to them and spoke to them, the leaders of the opposition. I said, will you not come and sit with Yariv Levin? You can make a deal here. And they said, no, absolutely not. This whole thing just has to go away. It was like a nightmare for them. It just has to go away. So I'm not saying that every single person who opposed it did it because they were a member of the white tribe and, and they didn't want to see themselves being replaced. Some of them saw actual flaws here. But again, the right response to seeing a flawed reform is come in and negotiate. I mean, obviously, it would be better for the coalition to pass this law with 80 votes watered down than to try to ram it through with 64 votes, in its pure version. So this is something that could have been negotiated. I really, I don't want to speak, if you push me, what really were their best arguments, right? Their best arguments, apart from certain local issues, in the way the thing was worded that could have been fixed, they didn't really have strong arguments.
It's interesting, though, the man on the street, I guess, really was reacting with sort of a primal fear, right? That, I remember speaking to one woman who's, in a same-sex marriage, and so forth, and she was almost in tears as she was describing how, these reforms could threaten her lifestyle and the nature of her existence in this country and so forth. Was there any basis to that, or is that? I mean, how would you respond to a person coming to you, with that extreme emotional angst?
Okay, look, it's very, very hard to debate politics on the basis of people's emotional angst. Okay, another thing that I think is important to say is we're talking about procedural matters here. In other words, what are the rules of the game? When you're designing the rules of the game, the first thing that you need to do is put yourself behind what's called the veil of ignorance, okay, in the following sense. The worst thing you could do is say, look, at the moment, the judges, are all, they look like me, okay? And the coalition, they don't look like me. So therefore, I'm going to try to shift as much power to the courts as I possibly can. That's not the way you create the rules of the game. The way you create rules of the game are, supposing I had no idea who the coalition is and who the courts are, how would I design the rules of the game? Now, if you have any sense at all, you understand that 20 years from now or 30 years from now, right, or take the framers of the American Constitution who are looking ahead hundreds of years, they say, well, we don't know the answers to any of these things. What we need to do is think about all the possible scenarios, right? All the things that might happen and what we would want under those circumstances. Now, it's clear that the people who came to you and said, oh, I'm scared to death of the Chareidim who are in the coalition, but I really love, this particular leftist judge, is not behind the veil of ignorance, right? So they couldn't possibly, if you're thinking that way, you're not going to be designing the rules right. Now, as I said, I'm a person who has great love and respect for individual liberty. I will always be on the side of people who want more individual liberty. If I believed that there was a law of nature that said that judges were always going to be advancing individual liberty and that that legislators were always going to be trying to take away my liberties, then I would be agreeing with them. But I know that that's not the case, okay? I know that, for example, when Chareidim want to have gender-separate classes, it's the legislature that wants to allow them, not to force anybody, but to allow them, and the courts are the one who are preventing it, okay? I know that when a prime minister gets elected by a majority and the court is willing to hear a petition that says, well, you should disqualify this person from being the prime minister for reasons that are not actually in the law, that they are taking away my civil rights. Okay, I as a voter, if I voted for somebody who won and then you say, no, you can't serve, you are taking away my civil rights. Now, it's not important that in that particular decision, the court decided not to rule that Bibi Netanyahu cannot be the prime minister. They ruled that he can be. But the operative part of that ruling was, oh, but we could have decided differently, right? This is up to us. It's at our discretion. And so far, we've decided that it's still okay, right? So these are examples, I'll just bring you to, two small examples of where I see the court as potentially taking away my liberty. So, the person who came to you in fear and panic that their liberty is going to be taken away, my response to them is, well, would you feel the same way if the court was a bunch of Gerach Hasidim and the Labor Party was running the coalition? Would you still think that the right balance, right, the checks and balances that we want here are the ones you're proposing now?
Fair point. I guess my last question on this, and I want to shift into where the Chareidim fit into all of this, is, people, I've heard it suggested that the mistake so to speak, or the shortcoming in the coalition or in the judicial reform was not in substance but in tactics. In other words, that it was rushed, that it was done sort of by fiat or by as sort of a show of force, as a kind of in a braggadocious way that we've now acquired this power and kind of shoving down people's throats, and sort of the public perception is what precipitated that outcry, as opposed to the actual substance of what was written. Do you think there's credence to that? Do you looking back wish that there had been more maybe prudence or more of a softer touch?
So the answer is yes and no. Yes, I already thought at the time, not only looking back, that this is the kind of thing that needed a rollout where you first kind of make your case to the public and kind of bring it on as you build public support, etc. That should have been done. I already at the time I said this to the people who were advancing it. This is not the way it should be done. We cannot be rushing this. We have to be doing this at a slower pace. We need to be doing this more gradually, and we need to be explaining this to the public. Okay. However, I don't think that had it been done more slowly, that it would not have engendered this, the same response from the hardcore opposition. It's true that people in the center who kind of, looked at the whole thing and said, yeah, these guys seem to be like, rushing and they're not explaining themselves, and we're better off without this. Yeah, maybe, they could have been brought along. But the people who kind of feel like this is our country, or you will not replace us, the you will not replace us people, right? They were already having crazy protests before Yariv Levin even announced this reform, okay? These are people who now they're called the Kaplanistim. They used to be called the Balfouristim, right? Because they're called Kaplanistim because they protested now in Tel Aviv on Kaplan Street. Yeah, they used to be protesting on Balfour Street, Yeah. So it's the same people, and it's the same people, by the way, who are the most radical with the Chatufim,
Right.
And I mean, these are people who will, whatever issue they can use as a cudgel against Bibi Netanyahu and his coalition will do it. So I agree that yes, it definitely should have been done differently, but no, it would not have fared any better in the end had it been done differently.
Okay, so now let's turn to the Chareidim, who are, of course, generally our focus on this program. Where do the Chareidim fit into all of this before October 7th? And then I guess where do they fit in now? And I guess I would frame the question by presenting the sort of or positing at least that my typical understanding of the way Chareidim tend to operate politically is very pragmatic and very focused on several very narrow core issues: subsidies to the Charedi population, draft, the army draft, and things like that, and other issues outside of that are sort of beyond the ken. Will kind of just go with the flow of the coalition, generally whatever sort of, I guess, Bibi's promoting or the like. Was that the case in this situation, or were there actual ideological bedfellows here, or opponents, for that matter, from the Charedi camp?
Okay, so we will now have covered the two most hot button issues in Israel.
Perfect.
We did judicial reform. Now we'll talk about Charedi draft, right? And we pretty much, covered the kind of things that bring people to blows in this country. So
good thing we're both Americans, So I guess you're living here, but still got New York in you. So
yeah, I still do. That's true. So the answer to your question is you're 100% right that the Chareidim generally have two or three issues that they care about. And the rest of it is basically chips that they can use, to trade in. Oh, the coalition, you guys need our vote on, A, B, and C. Well, guess what? You will have it, in exchange for your support on, subsidies and the draft, right? Which more or less are the issues that they care about. In this particular instance, however, judicial reform is something that they took a great interest in, because they understood actually quite correctly that it wouldn't help them to get the kind of legislation passed that they want, whether it's subsidies or the draft, right? If the court is going to strike it down. Now, the issue that they cared about most was the draft exemption, and they saw the court as their enemy on this, right? Because now, let me just give you a little bit of the history. The history is important. You got a couple of minutes?
Yes, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. Already back in the 70s, there were petitions to the court saying that the Chareidim should not be exempted from the draft. There were two cases in the 80s, one in 1981 and the other in 1986, both brought by the same guy, okay, a lawyer named Ressler. There's Ressler Aleph and Ressler Bet, okay? In Ressler Aleph, he comes to the court, and he's a soldier, and he says it's not fair that the Chareidim don't get drafted. I do get drafted, equality, etc. And he gets thrown out of court. They say you have no standing, and this is not a justiciable case, right? These are the kinds of issues that need to be handled by the other branches of government. The court's not going to get involved in this, okay? Now, I'm sure it strikes those, listeners who were in the know that the court ever said such a thing, right? That there's actually an issue that's not justiciable. But they did. That was in 81. In 86, Ressler comes back. At this point, he's just in Miluim. He's not even, serving in the regular army. And Aaron Barak now is on the thing. And Aaron Barak says, well, everybody has standing in this courtroom, and B, everything is justiciable, right? So that's in the second Ressler decision in 86. Then there's a whole bunch of decisions in the 90s where the argument is, look, all of this is being done as government policy, army policy, etc. You need to have real legislation on this, right? You've got to legislate. If the Chareidim are going to get an exemption, it's got to be legislated by the Knesset. Okay, so the Knesset legislates it. It took many, many years for this to get legislated. Okay, it took many years, but eventually they passed Chok Tal.
Tal law, yeah.
Yeah, the Tal law. And then the court comes and strikes it down, says it's inadequate, there's not enough sanctions against Chareidim who don't serve, there's not a high enough percentage.
Representation,
et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this happens again, it happens a third time, they keep changing the law, and every time the court comes and strikes down the law. And now finally, the court a couple of years ago came and said, well, there is no law exempting Chareidim, so why isn't the army drafting the Chareidim? And that's what, set the new, the latest round going. Now, the Chareidim understood well then that even if there was a fourth law passed, right, they were working on a fourth law that would exempt, at least exempt many Chareidim from the army, and they said, well, wait a minute, if we don't have the court, if we allow the court to strike it down, we have no means for the court, to stop the court from striking it down, then we haven't accomplished anything. So their big Yeshua was the override. They said, the override's a thing. Even if the court comes and strikes it down, well, we'll just override, and that'll be that. Now, well, that turned out to be a disaster. Okay, the override. I mean, if you ask me, the one thing that most people who had a clue what was in the reform were really upset about, it was the override. And I myself thought that the override
I can hear, I mean,
is,
again, if it's not a supermajority, then I can hear that. If it's a supermajority, then we're talking about...
Well, I personally thought that even doing it with a supermajority would actually be a mistake, because what would happen is, it's like telling the court, you've got another pair of brakes in the back seat. So what they did, step on the gas, right? They'd start striking things down left and right. You guys want to override? Bavakasha, go and override. But the Knesset would never override, okay? And it would have been a complete disaster. So I personally think that there should be no override. But in any case, especially the Gera Rebbe was really, really hot on the override. Okay, he's not my family Ger Chassidim, and I far be it from me to criticize the Gera Rebbe, but I have to say that he is not regarded as the most pragmatic of Rebbes. Okay, look, what everybody involved in this reform knew was this override is not actually going to pass, right? We need it now. We need it now, first of all, as a bargaining chip that we could take out later. And second of all, in the meantime, we have to keep the Ger Rebbe happy, right? Because he controls a significant portion of Yadut HaTorah, specifically, right? Some of the Chassidish guys in the thing, right? Okay, so that was that was a major sticking point over here. So the long answer to your question, but now saying it briefly, is the Chareidim were very invested in this.
Although again, it's interesting that they weren't invested in some sort of abstract, dispassionate sense. They were as a sort of a handmaiden to this.
Yes.
These core issues that they care about otherwise.
Correct.
Already. Yeah.
Exactly. They saw this as a vehicle for things that were actually important to them, and therefore, they were very, very supportive of this.
So, I guess where things stand today, what is the status of Judicial Forum as of the day we were recording this? This is in late February of 2025. Who knows by the time we release it, which will be sometime after that. But where is it right now as we stand?
So, what happened was that the entire reform, because there were only 64 people in the coalition, nobody in the opposition was supporting it. And the coalition did not want to pass it with 64 votes, and a couple of those were wobbly, so it might have even been like with 61 or 62 votes.
And why not?
And they kind of felt that it would be pushing too far given the amount of opposition there was, especially bearing in mind that the opposition was willing to cross a lot of red lines in the way they opposed. So there was calls for insubordination.
But even though they ultimately ended up showing in great numbers,
they did. Right? But of course, all this is pre-October 7th, and one doesn't know, and especially if you've got pilots who are going, we're not going to fly. So the coalition was legitimately afraid.
That was then, but I'm saying now we've seen that they will in fact fly.
Let me just tell you what happened then, and then we'll catch it up to now. Okay. So what happened in the end, that the coalition did not want to pass it back in the day. They didn't think they had the support. They thought that the price would be too high, especially with calls for insubordination. In the end, they only passed one small part, which is the what's called spirut, right? That you cannot use the court cannot use unreasonableness alone as a criterion for ruling that a government decision cannot stand. Right? There were many reasons that the court can rule that it can't stand. If it wasn't done according to proper procedures with the proper authority, it was done.
But this was just too subjective.
But this criteria was just we don't agree with it. Right? I mean, there are in other countries, like in England, there's the Wensbury. In the United States, is arbitrary and capricious, which is something that one very rarely invokes because it has to be really kooky. But what happened here was that Barak, and I mentioned before the Yellow Pages decision in 1980, he basically said it doesn't have to be Wensbury crazy, which is crazy. It's enough that they didn't balance all of the different considerations exactly the way we would do it, that's a very elegant way of saying if we disagree with it, we're going to...
Right, becomes a substitute legislature.
It's just a substitute legislature. So that tiny thing was passed, and it was passed in a basic law, right, which means it was like a constitutional legislation. And the court then came and struck even that down. And that was during the war. During the war, the court came and said, we're striking down essentially what we ourselves regard as a clause in the Constitution. And they said, well, we could do it based on the Declaration of Independence, and all kinds of bizarre arguments.
Even though it was a basic law.
Even though it was a basic law, yeah. They didn't have any legal way to strike it down because there's nothing above a basic law. So they started grasping at straws, which was really quite sad. Now, then the war broke out, and nobody really has an appetite for a big fight. Okay, but it seems that some people do have an appetite for a big fight because the court, after it struck down a basic law, which was that's bucking for a fight, then the next thing they did was Yariv Levin, who's because he's justice minister, is also the chairman of the Judicial Selection Committee, and he was dead set on Yitzhak Amit becoming the chief justice. So what he did is he didn't have the votes, but he did have the prerogative of the chairman not to bring it up for a vote, right? Because the agenda of the committee is entirely at the discretion of the chairman. That's what a chairman is. So he didn't bring it up for a vote. So they went to court. Of course, this is Yitzhak Amit's colleagues. They went to the Supreme Court and said, you have to force the committee, you have to force Yariv Levin to convene the committee and to hold a vote on the Chief Justice. Now, the court had absolutely no legal basis for doing this, but they did it anyway, right? And then the 3 right-wingers out of 9 on the committee said, well, we're not going to attend this meeting if we're being forced by the court to convene. So they didn't. And the other 6 members, the left-wingers, they convened the committee themselves, right, which they can't do. They do not have the authority to do this, but they did it. And they appointed Yitzchak Amit to be the Chief Justice. Now, I should add that the courts are very, very makpid about any possible conflict of interest, about any time somebody gets appointed and there's some suggestion that they may have once done something wrong, like, Yoav Gallant, who was once slated to be the head of the army, right? And they said, well, he's never been convicted of anything, but he kind of built across his property line. Literally, he is being investigated for building across his property line. That was enough for him to be disqualified, okay? Now, again, he was not convicted. He didn't even stand trial. He wasn't even indicted. He was being investigated. Now, Yitzchak Amit, okay, this happens all the time. It's a Maisa B'chol Yom, okay? Maisa B'chol Yom. This guy, Yitzchak Amit, turns out that there were accusations of all kinds of things about also, building illegally on his property, et cetera, et cetera. And people said, well, wait a minute, you have to apply the same standards to appointing the Supreme Court judge, at least the same standards, Supreme Court justice, as the Supreme Court applies, Chief Justice, as the court applies to 1,000 other things, right? From the chief of police to the head of the army to the prison authority to you name it. And instead they just rammed it through. They said, no, nothing to see here. Move along. So the court really has been bucking for a fight. And the Attorney General has been, every time the government tries to appoint somebody, they come up with a reason why you can't appoint that person, even when it's all done according to law, according to procedures, mamash kel chesa. So what's going on here is that they are bucking for a fight, but the coalition is, they're going, we can't put up with this much longer, but there really is not an appetite in the country for a fight. He says, what do you do? What do you do when you've got these extremists on one side constantly agitating for a fight, and you really don't want to fight? It's a tough call. It's a tough call. I think what's going to have to happen is, I don't think we're going to, there's a compromise proposal on the table. Gideon Sa'ar, who's one of the leading opponents of judicial reform, and Yariv Levin, who was, the main supporter, the two of them have a compromise about a small change to how justices are appointed. That might pass, or it might not. If it does pass, there's a good chance the court will strike it down on the basis of absolutely nothing. But they don't want it.
So let's just bring it back and to kind of wrap up and bring it back to the Chareidim again, because what I often hear when we talk about we've covered the topic of Chareidim in the army and the draft extensively, 14 or 15 episodes, something like that, from every conceivable angle, but not really from this one actually. So maybe not yet from every conceivable angle, but this issue specifically, I've heard many Chareidim say, and again, I don't know if this is kind of a surface or a sort of the superficial explanation or justification. This is a deeper rationale, but they will say that, look, we're willing to compromise, we're willing to make a deal, but because of the judiciary, we cannot trust the government as far as we can, throw them, so to speak, and therefore any deal is irrelevant from our perspective until there's some sort of reform to this whole process, and then once that happens, we will make a deal. Now, obviously, there are those who are quite skeptical about that altogether. Do they really want to make a deal? Is that a good faith statement or not? But how do you see the sort of the intersection of the draft issue and judicial reform as it stands today? Is that truly the obstacle, or is it simply a fig leaf that's being, kind of employed to stall or to avoid this situation?
To be fair, there were really two very central issues in terms of the Charedi draft exemption. Yeah, one is, yes, as long as you know that you've got the court waiting in the wings, as a sword, you understand that almost any arrangement that you come to is tentative, it's possibly temporary, and you have no idea, right, if the deal that you're making has any meaning, long-term consequences. Yes. All that is true. But there's something else that's true, and I'm sure that in your 14 episodes you covered this, but nevertheless, if you asked me, I have to answer you honestly. There's another problem, which is that what once was a consensus is no longer a consensus. I mean, there was once this view that said, look, Dati people, right, Dati Lumi people could say, look, it's true the army doesn't really need Chareidim in the army. It's just a matter of principle, right? That it's not fair and
equality,
equality, et cetera, et cetera. Well, for an abstract principle, maybe it would be better, there are people who are learning Torah. That's very nice. And, we don't want to take them away from their Gemaras for an abstract principle. Or maybe we should at least just, and I heard this from many, many people on the left, many people. They said, you know what? Why don't we just give the Chareidim, an early exemption so that they, those who don't want to be learning in yeshiva won't learn in yeshiva. They'll go and get a job.
At least contribute to the economy.
It'll be contribute to the economy. That's what they. So I wouldn't say this was a very broad consensus, but if you took all the different arguments together, because people can say, look, we're not going to go crazy over this charedi issue.
There's no great sense of urgency.
Not a great sense of urgency. Either it's better to just let them work, or it's nice that they're learning, and principle of equality isn't enough. But that situation has changed. Yeah. As everybody in the country saw, we actually do need soldiers, right?
The conceptia failed.
That failed. So once you realize that technology isn't going to save us, and a small smart army is not enough. You actually need, in addition to your small smart army, a big dumb army that just goes out there and fights. Suddenly, the people who in the past would have said, yeah, let's just get this over with already, are no longer willing to say that, right? The left, it's true, many of them see this issue as a way of dividing the right. Okay,
which is true because the Dati Lumi are the most upset right now, which understandably since about 60% of the casualties coming from within their ranks.
Exactly. It's so if you're a clever and nasty left winger who says, well, we've got to break up this whole right wing coalition of Chareidim and Dati Lumi and Likudnikim, this is a great issue to put front and center because you'll put them at each other's throats. But the truth is, as you already said, it's not just the Chilonim who are saying it. The Dati Lumi crowd is now looking, going, wait a minute, this really doesn't make. And especially, I'll tell you quite personally, I try to stay above the fray when it comes to all these things. My background is very mixed. My friends are all over the place. I understand everybody's. I'm sympathetic with everybody's, arguments. I have no hatred in my heart for anybody. The fact is, my sons-in-law were fighting in Khan Yunis, were fighting in Lebanon, we fight for months and months. My son, between battles, was learning Daf Yomi, right? It's really hard for me, to buy this argument that says, we shouldn't go to the army. By the way, the argument changes from, right? So if you say, one day it's, well, this is really like not our country. This is this is a Zionist secular country. Why should we be contributing to that? That's one day's argument. Then but then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, this country is, the people who are actually fighting the wars of this country are not, secular anti-Charedi people. They're not. They're people who are learning Daf Yomi between battles, right? Okay, that argument's out. Well, we need people, who are learning Torah all day, because in the schus of people learning Torah all day, and they say, well, I don't know, this is beginning to look like a Melchemes mitzvah, your argument is a little bit, is looking a little bit, well, okay, the conditions in the army are such that a frum person can't go there and stay from, okay, well, now we have the Hashmonaim, right, and you can have all the conditions.
So this is where they would say the trust issue. This is where they would say, that's today, what's tomorrow, what's the day after?
Okay, so look, in the bottom line is that even people of truly goodwill are losing patience with these arguments, right? Because the arguments really don't hold water. And the true, honest argument of the Chareidim is this: look, we are a minority in this country. We've been a minority in the Gullus for the last 2,000 years, right? And our strategy has always been one of isolation. right? It's one of isolation. There's been two strategies that are tried. There's accommodation and there's isolation. If you look at accommodation, most of the time it doesn't work. It slowly but inexorably leads to assimilation. We want to put up big walls, right? That argument is the true and fair argument, and it's the best argument that there is, okay? But when you look at it from the point of view of somebody who isn't there, right? So in the Gullus, right, you know, an American can look at, you know, people who want to have their little ghetto in Williamsburg or in, you know, in Kiryas Yoel and go right ahead, my akhbatli, right? It really doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is the idea that, no, we want to be isolated, we want to protect ourselves, we don't trust you, the only way that we can stay the way we are is by being isolated, it is more and more falling on deaf ears over here. So, you know, it's sad but true, and I wish I knew what the solution to all this was, but I don't.
Well, let's try to end on a maybe, I don't know if a more cheerful note, but with a prognostication. Where do you see this all going? You know, you've been sitting from your perch as someone who has been called the intellectual architect of judicial reform, at least in one article I read. And you know, where do you see things moving? You know, the coalition is what it is. The demographics are what they are, and the country is moving in some sort of direction. You know, God willing, the war will end. Who knows when and how and so forth. And there will be a hunger for some sort of accommodation from both sides of the table. And, you know, whether the pro-judicial reform camp saying, okay, you know, we are still in control and we want to get this through, or the anti saying, okay, now it's back to business as usual and we've got to settle this once and for all. What do you see ultimately happening?
Okay.
And nobody's gambling based on this prediction. So just we'll take it for what it's worth.
Exactly. So look, what's likely to happen is there's going to be an election here in another year or so, let's say, right? You know, either end of 25, sometime beginning of 26. There'll probably be an election. Probably the coalition that comes out of it is going to include some new parties, but basically it's going to straddle the center, okay? Because let's face it, whoever is able to put together government is not going to see Ben-Gvir as a fantastic partner, probably not going to have an appetite for the Chareidim being in the coalition. On the other hand, nobody's going to want any of the Arab parties, not even the ones that make believe that they're moderated. And probably Yair Golan is going to be so unpalatable that nobody's going to want him either. Now, if you take what's left, okay, so you're talking about, Likud and Lieberman and Gantz, and whatever new
Bennett makes a comeback.
Bennett makes a comeback. There'll probably be another right-wing party because the Likud is, who knows what's going to be with Bibi. You put all this together, you've got your 70-something seats. Basically, they might be able to come to agreement on, things like economic issues, but on the real fissure, which is going to run down the middle of the next coalition, which is, okay, who runs this country? Is it the old, unelected elite who actually run all these institutions, or is it going to be, the right wing? Right? All of these big issues are going to fester during that government, and then a few years later, there'll be another election, and then all of the heroes of this war, etc., the new builders of the country, who don't talk about unity because they actually live in it.
Hopefully, they will actually continue to live
it. They are going to become the leadership of the country in the election after that in 5 years, and then Uvalatio Goel.
Yeah, that is a cheerful and optimistic, sunny prediction there, and I would like to gamble on that, because yes, and that is the great. This was a generation so much maligned. The TikTok generation, the I generation. And then of course they showed up in just extraordinary ways. As their performance in the war and the hostages themselves. As we hear the stories of these young people coming out with just unfathomable courage and faith, it's really just mind-boggling. And so one can only hope that perhaps we can pin our hopes for future governance, a governance of sensibility and, as you said, unity and fraternity that could potentially emerge from these ranks, would usher in a much more palatable and ultimately sustainable kind of future. So we'll leave it at that. Professor Moshe Koppel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.